My name is Sylvia Harper. I am 65 years old. Once I was a wife, a mother, and the quiet backbone of a family that never asked where the meals came from or how the bills got paid. I was the kind of woman people forget to thank because they think love has no receipts. Now I live alone in a small yellow house at the edge of Millfield, where the wind always carries the sound of a clock ticking from somewhere inside the walls. That sound used to comfort me. Now it feels like it counts the seconds of something ending. Yesterday, my son Evan posted a video that broke whatever was left of my peace. The title read, "That face suits you, old lady." The camera shook as he laughed, walking into my kitchen with his phone pointed straight at me. I was humming while stirring soup, wearing the same cardigan I've worn for years. He mimicked my voice, my walk, my gray hair. The comments came like stones thrown at glass. "Look at her. She's ridiculous. Poor guy, having a mom like that." I didn't scream. I didn't even look away. I just pressed the lock button and put the phone face down beside my teacup. Then I smiled, a small, polite smile, the kind that once kept peace at dinner tables, the kind that hides a storm, because I had already decided something the world didn't know yet. The next morning, Evan went to the bank. He was expecting to withdraw the rent money I always transferred on the first Monday of every month. The young teller, Mr. Daniels, looked at the screen, then at him, and lowered his voice. "I'm sorry, sir. Balance 0. All accounts deleted." For a second, I imagined his face. The disbelief, the panic, the same lips that called me ridiculous pressed together in silence. The same hands that had once clung to my apron when thunder scared him, now trembling over an empty bank slip. They say a mother's heart never stops forgiving. Maybe that's true, but mine learned to protect itself first. What no one knew, not the neighbors, not his followers, not even Evan, was that I had spent the night before sitting at my kitchen table under the pale light of the lamp, sorting through every document I had saved in 40 years. The house deed, the rental contracts, the trust account I opened after his father died. It took one phone call, one signature, and one deep breath. Everything was transferred back into my name. Every door he thought he owned was quietly locked from the inside. I didn't do it to punish him. I did it because love without boundaries turns into permission for cruelty. When the teller whispered those words, "Balance 0," the story didn't end. It began. That was the morning my son met the quiet side of justice. And that was the morning I stopped being the mother he could mock. You might think I was angry, but anger is loud. And I had learned long ago that real strength doesn't raise its voice. It just waits. And when the time is right, it signs its name, firm, steady, final. The clock in my hallway ticked 12 times that morning. Each tick felt like a stitch being pulled through fabric, old wounds closing themselves. Outside, the town went on as usual. Cars passed. Someone's dog barked. The mail truck rumbled by. And inside my house, I poured a cup of coffee and watched the steam rise, thin and white, like forgiveness taking shape. That's how this story begins. Not with shouting, not with revenge, but with a mother realizing that silence can be louder than any apology she'll never receive. Because before that morning, I had already stopped being the woman everyone mistook for weak, and by the time Evan's account showed 0, my own heart finally balanced itself again. I know what you might be thinking. How did it come to this? How does a boy who once brought me dandelions from the backyard become a man who trades his mother's dignity for online applause? I'll tell you. But not to make you hate him. I'll tell you because maybe somewhere another mother is scrolling through her phone right now, pretending not to see the video her own child just posted, and maybe she needs to know she's not alone. So before I tell you what I did next, take a deep breath with me. This isn't a story about revenge. It's a story about boundaries, about the moment a woman realizes she has nothing left to lose but her silence, and decides to make it count. The morning after that frozen smile in the bank, My phone rang before I'd even had my first sip of coffee. It was Nora, my neighbor of 30 years, a woman who still brought me pumpkin pie every Thanksgiving, even after her knees gave out. Her voice was trembling. "Sylvia, please don't look at TikTok today." Her words were broken, almost pleading. I could hear her breathing hard on the other end, the kind of breath people take when they're about to say something cruel, but don't want to be the one to do it. I pressed the phone tighter to my ear. "Why, Nora? What happened?" She hesitated, then whispered, "It's about Evan. He posted something. It's not right. Just don't watch it, honey, please." But of course, I did. Curiosity is a cruel thing. It doesn't knock. It just walks in and sits down beside your heart. I opened the app, and there he was. My son, Evan Harper, standing in my own kitchen, the same one where I taught him to whisk pancake batter and slice apples safely. The camera shook as he turned it toward me. I was in the background, humming a tune, stirring soup on the stove. He looked at the camera and smirked. "That face suits you, old lady," he said, mimicking my voice in a high-pitched tone. "Still rocking that 1980s perm like it's prom night." The comments flew across the screen like thrown stones. "LOL, she's hilarious." "Poor guy. Imagine growing up with that." "She looks like a thrift store grandma." Every word was a bruise. The pot began to boil, over, soup spilling onto the stove, hissing as it hit the flame. But I didn't move. I just stood there, staring at that tiny screen. The world had suddenly shrunk to a 6-inch rectangle where strangers dissected my face as if it belonged to them. I couldn't feel my hands. I couldn't even blink. The sound of Evan's laughter cut through the kitchen like a blade wrapped in silk. "That face suits you, old lady." It echoed again and again until it stopped sounding like words and more like a curse. In the video, he kept filming, walking closer. He imitated my slow steps, my way of talking to the cat, my small pauses before I answered a question. His followers flooded the comments with laughing emojis, and he laughed with them. That was the part that shattered me. Not the words, but the laughter. Because laughter is what used to heal every wound in this house. When Evan was little, I could cure his fear of thunderstorms with one silly face and a giggle. Now that same sound felt like thunder breaking inside my chest. I turned off the stove. The smell of burnt soup filled the room. For a moment, everything went silent. The clock ticked on the wall, the fridge hummed. The world didn't care that something inside me had cracked. I sat down at the kitchen table, the same table where I'd once helped Evan with his homework, where I'd wrapped his birthday gifts in brown paper because we couldn't afford store-bought ones. I looked at the phone, still glowing on the counter, and whispered, "My boy, what have you done?" The light from the window fell across the table, dust floating through it like slow snow. I reached for the phone again, pressed pause on the video, and stared at the frozen frame. His grin, the mockery in his eyes, the world laughing behind him. I thought about calling him. I thought about defending myself, about explaining that my hair looked that way because I couldn't afford the salon after his father died, that my hands were wrinkled because I worked too many nights sewing for other people's children. But the truth sank in quietly. He already knew. He just didn't care. That was the hardest part. I placed the phone face down and watched the reflection of the clock in the polished wood table. Tick, tick, tick. Each sound felt like a question I couldn't answer. Outside, a lawnmower started, the smell of cut grass slipping through the window. The ordinary world kept turning. And I, sitting in that chair, realized that humiliation can be strangely calm. It doesn't shout or break things. It just sits beside you, breathing the same air, until you recognize it as part of you. When night came, I moved to the old wooden chair near the window. The moonlight slid through the curtain, pale and cold. I held the phone in both hands, my fingers trembling slightly. The screen was dark now, but I could still see it. The image of my son's face, laughing at me. I whispered his name once, softly, as if he might hear it across the miles. Then I set the phone down on the side table, turned off the light, and sat in the dark. "That face suits you, old lady." The words came back, quieter this time, as if they were trying to see if I'd react. I didn't. I simply breathed. Because sometimes silence is not a weakness. It's the sound of something changing shape inside you. In that silence, I remembered who I used to be before motherhood became my entire identity. Before my worth depended on someone else's love, I thought of my younger self, sewing in the dim light of the kitchen, whispering promises that life would be kind. And I realized, for the first time in years, that I didn't owe anyone an explanation for surviving. I looked down at my hands, trembling slightly in the moonlight. Wrinkled, yes. Tired, yes. But steady, capable, still mine. The clock ticked once more. I picked up the phone and turned it off completely. The moonlight brushed across my face as I leaned back in the chair. Outside, a dog barked, and the town drifted into its small, indifferent sleep. I didn't cry. I didn't shout. I just sat there, watching the reflection of the moon on the window pane. It wasn't peaceful yet, but it was the first quiet moment that belonged only to me. That was the night I realized something every mother eventually learns the hard way. Sometimes the people you raise will outgrow your sacrifices before they even see them. And sometimes the only thing left to do is stop explaining and start remembering who you are beneath all the giving. The next morning, the house felt heavier than usual. Light slipped through the curtains in soft strips, landing on the dust that floated in the air like faint ghosts. The clock ticked, steady and stubborn, as if to remind me that no amount of hurt could pause time. I moved slowly, almost afraid of the quiet. My coffee sat untouched on the counter. I kept glancing at the empty chair across the table, the one Evan used to sit in, swinging his legs and asking endless questions about why pancakes were round and not square. I caught myself smiling at that memory, and for a second, the laughter in my mind was still small and innocent, before it turned cruel. Maybe that's the worst kind of grief, the kind that doesn't come from death, but from watching someone you love become a stranger while still carrying your last name. The hallway was lined with framed pictures. Evan at 5, holding a fishing rod. Evan at 10, with missing front teeth. Evan at 18, in his graduation robe, looking into the camera with that same defiant sparkle that used to charm everyone. I stopped in front of each frame, touching the glass as though it could still hold warmth. His old bedroom door creaked when I pushed it open. The smell of cedar and old cologne drifted out, soft and stale. The blue curtains were faded now, the bed neatly made, the desk covered in a thin coat of dust. It was like a museum for a boy who'd forgotten he once lived here. I started dusting, just to keep my hands busy. Each object told a story: a baseball glove, a dried-out science fair project, a crooked picture of the three of us, me, Evan, and his father, standing in front of the yellow house the day we moved in. I looked younger there, hair still chestnut brown, eyes unburdened. On the top shelf of the closet, hidden behind a stack of board games, I found a small tin box. It was scratched, its lid slightly bent, but I recognized it instantly. The edges of my mouth lifted before I even touched it. It was the marble box Evan had carried everywhere as a child. Inside were his favorite glass marbles, blue, green, amber, each one a tiny world trapped in glass. He used to line them up on the kitchen floor and tell me their names. This one's the ocean, this one's forest, this one's fire. He would hold them up to the sunlight, and the whole room would shimmer with color. I sat down on the floor with the box in my lap. When I opened it, the faint clinking sound of the marbles sent me spiraling back in time. It was a summer afternoon, years ago, the kind where cicadas sang like they were warning the world not to forget how hot the day was. Evan had just turned 7. He ran toward me, clutching the tin box, his hair sticking up in every direction. "Look, Mama, I found the rare one, the golden one." He held up a marble that wasn't really gold, just a swirl of honey and sunlight. But to him, it was treasure. Then he looked up at me with that open, honest face and said, "You're the prettiest, Mama." He said it so seriously, so certain, like a fact that could never change. Back then, I laughed. tugged his ear gently, and told him I didn't care much about pretty things. But the truth is, I never forgot those words. Now, years later, sitting on that dusty floor, I realized that maybe love is built out of small sentences like that. The ones that seem ordinary until time turns them into relics. I rolled one of the marbles between my fingers. The light hit it just right, scattering tiny rainbows on the wall. I wondered what it would take to bring that boy back, the one who saw beauty instead of flaws, who used to hold my hand in crowded stores and whisper, "Don't let go." Maybe he was still in there, buried beneath all the noise, beneath the followers and cameras and the need to be seen by strangers. Maybe. I stood up, carrying the box to the window. Outside, the garden I once planted with him was overgrown. The white fence needed paint. The old oak tree still stood tall, its branches stretching toward the same sky that once held our shared laughter. I closed my eyes and heard his child's voice again. "Don't let go, Mama." It's strange how memory works. It doesn't ask for permission. It just arrives, unannounced, bringing both comfort and pain in the same breath. The tin box felt heavier than it should have. Not because of the marbles, but because of everything they held. Birthdays, scraped knees, bedtime stories, all sealed inside. I sat on his bed, running my fingers across the old blanket. The fabric was frayed, soft from too many washes. There was a small tear near the corner, one I'd mended years ago with uneven stitches. I remembered sewing that night while Evan slept, promising myself I'd always be able to fix whatever broke. But some things, I was learning, don't want to be fixed. They just want to be accepted for the cracks they carry. I placed the box back in my lap and whispered, "Maybe love doesn't disappear. It just sleeps." The words came out so quietly that I almost didn't hear them myself. I imagined love like those marbles, still shining, still whole, even when left in the dark for years. You just have to find the courage to open the box again. The house groaned softly as the wind pushed against the walls. I stayed there a while longer, watching the light shift across the floor, watching the colors from the marbles dance across the walls. It felt almost holy, that silence, like forgiveness hovering in the air, waiting to be named. I put the marbles back into their box, one by one, as if tucking each memory to sleep. When I closed the lid, the faint click echoed through the room like the closing of a chapter. I placed the box on the desk, beside the old photo of us. Evan's smile stared back at me, bright, fearless, unaware of all the miles that would one day stretch between us. Then I whispered to the photograph, "You were a good boy once. I hope you remember that." The afternoon sun warmed the room, brushing against the back of my hand. For a fleeting second, I thought I felt a smaller hand there too, his hand the way it used to fit inside mine. Then it was gone. I turned off the light, stepped out, and gently closed the door behind me. The click of the latch was soft, final, almost kind. As I walked back down the hallway, the smell of soup still lingered from the night before, burnt but familiar. I poured myself a new cup of coffee, sat by the window, and let the warmth fill the spaces that guilt had hollowed out. The marbles remained upstairs, quietly sleeping in their box. And for the first time since that video, I didn't feel broken, just paused. Sometimes that's enough. The morning after finding the marble box, I decided to go into town. I told myself I just needed groceries, maybe fresh bread or a few apples. But the truth was, I needed to feel the world around me again, to see if it still recognized me as someone other than a punchline. The sky was pale, a washed-out blue, and the air had that brittle stillness only small towns know after something scandalous has been whispered into every kitchen. I parked outside Lyle's Market, the same grocery store I'd been going to for 30 years, the same bell above the door, the same floor tiles cracked in the same places. But when I stepped, inside it felt different, too quiet, too alert. Two young women near the produce section glanced up from their phones. One leaned toward the other, murmuring, "That's her, the TikTok mom." They didn't even lower their voices. They just looked at me, a mixture of pity and amusement on their faces, then turned away, giggling behind their screens. For a moment, I wanted to disappear into the oranges. My hands trembled slightly as I reached for a bag of apples. I could feel their eyes still on me, the weight of their judgment pressing like humidity against my skin. At the counter, Mr. Lyle barely met my gaze. His smile, usually warm, easy, looked rehearsed now, forced. "Morning, Mrs. Harper," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "Out early today." I nodded, offering a polite smile of my own. Just needed a few things. He rang up the items one by one, his fingers moving slower than normal, as though each beep of the scanner might offend me. When he handed me the receipt, he looked past my shoulder instead of into my eyes, and that's when I saw it, on the small TV above the counter, muted but unmistakable. The same frozen image of my kitchen, of Evan's phone pointed at me, my startled face captured mid-turn. Someone had uploaded the clip again, cut shorter this time, with bold text across the bottom. "POV, your mom still thinks the internet is magic." I felt heat crawl up my neck. Even without sound, I could see Evan's mouth move. I knew the line by heart. "That face suits you, old lady." The image burned into me like sunlight on glass. I couldn't move. I think Mr. Lyle realized I'd seen it because he quickly turned his back, pretending to rearrange a stack of paper bags. I walked out of the store, the bell above the door chiming too loudly in my ears. Outside, the air felt thinner. Across the street, Nora stood in front of her florist shop, wiping her hands on her apron. When she saw me, she froze. For a second, I thought she might turn away, but then she crossed the street and came straight to me, her eyes full of something between guilt and kindness. "Oh, Sylvia," she said softly, reaching for my arm. "People can be so cruel. You shouldn't have to see all that." I tried to laugh it off. "Don't worry, Nora, I've survived worse storms." But my voice cracked in the middle, betraying me. She looked like she wanted to hug me, but we both knew what that would mean. Two women standing on Main Street, one of them already branded the TikTok mom. People were watching from the cafe window. I could feel it. So instead, she patted my arm lightly, as if comfort had to stay invisible to be safe. Then she said something that stayed with me. "You've always carried yourself with grace, Sylvia. Don't let them take that too." I nodded, but the words hit harder than she knew, because I wasn't sure I still had any grace left to carry. The drive home felt longer than usual. Every stoplight, every pedestrian seemed to know my story. I caught one man at a crosswalk whispering to someone beside him, and even though I couldn't hear what he said, my mind filled in the blanks. When I pulled into my driveway, I left the groceries in the car and went straight to the porch. The porch swing creaked under my weight as I sat, staring at the old oak tree, the one Evan used to climb when he wanted to see the world from higher up. I wondered what he'd see now, if he looked down from there. His mother, small and still in a house that once felt safe. Inside, the kettle whistled faintly. I'd forgotten I'd turned it on. I poured a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table. The steam rose between me and the sunlight like a curtain I could hide behind. I whispered to no one in particular, "A mother's dignity used to be her son's shelter. Now it's his content." The words tasted bitter and true. I let them linger in the air, heavy but necessary. The tea grew cold, untouched. I traced the rim of the cup with my finger, feeling the rough edge where the porcelain had chipped years ago. Evan had done that too, knocked it against the sink while trying to help me wash dishes. He was 12 then. He'd said sorry at least 10 times. And now he used the same kitchen sink as the backdrop for a joke. I don't know how long I sat there, staring at that chipped cup. The clock ticked on the wall, steady, unbothered. Tick, tick, tick. In that sound, something inside me began to settle. Not peace, not forgiveness, but a kind of awakening. A realization that shame only holds power when you let it live rent-free inside your heart. I stood up, walked to the mirror above the stove, and looked at myself. The reflection wasn't kind, but it was honest. My eyes were tired, my skin soft with years, my mouth set in a quiet line of endurance. I touched the gray streak in my hair, the one Evan had mocked in the video. It shimmered faintly in the sunlight. I whispered, half to myself, "If being ordinary makes me laughable, then so be it. I've lived long enough to know that ridicule passes faster than love." Outside, a group of teenagers passed by, their voices loud, careless, full of the kind of confidence that comes from not yet knowing how fragile dignity can be. One of them said, "Hey, that's her," and laughed. I didn't flinch this time. I just turned off the kettle's leftover whistle, cleaned the counter, and poured myself another cup of tea. Sometimes defiance doesn't need an audience. It just needs to exist quietly, like breath. As the afternoon light shifted across the table, I thought of my younger self again, the woman who once believed motherhood was a permanent shield against loneliness. I understood now that it wasn't a shield at all. It was a choice, a daily act of standing up even when no one applauds. When the phone buzzed again with notifications from strangers, comments, reposts, apologies that weren't really apologies, I silenced it and placed it in a drawer. Then I looked out the window at the oak tree, and for the first time since this all began, I didn't feel like the TikTok mom. I felt like a woman reclaiming her own story. That night, sleep refused to come. The house was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the faint tapping of rain against the windows. Every creak in the floorboards felt louder. Every second on the clock stretched thin and heavy. I sat in bed for a long time, staring at the ceiling, replaying the voices I had heard at the market. That's her, the TikTok mom. It echoed in my mind like a song I didn't choose but couldn't turn off. Finally, I got up. Barefoot, I walked down the hallway toward the old wooden cabinet that had stood in the corner since the year Evan was born. It used to hold linens and holiday cards. Now it held something else. Everything that truly belonged to me. I opened the door, and the faint scent of cedar drifted out. Inside was a wooden chest, small but solid, with brass corners worn down by time. I hadn't touched it in years. When I pulled it out, dust puffed into the air, swirling in the yellow lamplight like fog. The hinges groaned as if the chest, too, was waking up from a long sleep. Inside were the papers of my life, the house deed, the rental contracts for the 2 small apartments I'd managed since my husband passed, the savings bonds I'd bought in small increments whenever I could spare a few dollars. Each document smelled faintly of paper and ink and quiet determination. I spread them out on the kitchen table one by one, smoothing the creases carefully, like someone preparing an altar. The lamplight spilled over everything, a soft golden glow that made the papers look sacred. I whispered to myself, he thought I was living off his success. He forgot I built everything with my own 2 hands. The words surprised me. They came out calm, without bitterness. It wasn't anger that filled me now. It was clarity. I sat down and opened a small notebook I used to keep grocery lists in. The first few pages were filled with scribbles, recipes, errands, phone numbers. But that night, I turned to a blank page and wrote in neat, steady letters. Plan for peace, not revenge. Then I set the pen down and just stared at those words. For a long while, the only sound was the rain outside, tapping against the windows like fingers trying to get my attention. I thought about how easy it would be to fight back loudly, to post something online, to call him out publicly, to demand an apology the world could witness. But that kind of fight never heals. It only multiplies the noise. Peace, I decided, would have to be built differently. Quietly, one careful decision at a time. I reached for the bank folder, flipping through the pages where Evan's name appeared as a secondary account holder. He had added himself years ago when I was recovering from surgery, and at the time it had felt comforting, like a safeguard. Now, seeing his signature there, the ink curling with pride, I felt something inside me shift. It wasn't anger, it was recognition. The realization that love can become entitlement if you never draw a line. I whispered again, almost tenderly, boundaries are love with walls. I picked up the phone and called Mr. Daniels at River State Bank. It was after hours, but the automated line allowed me to freeze access and schedule an appointment for the morning. My voice didn't shake once. When the confirmation tone beeped, I exhaled slowly. The decision was made, not to punish my son, but to protect the part of me that had been disappearing one apology at a time. The question that would divide people later, the one that would fill the comment sections and spark quiet debates, was already forming in my mind. Was she right to cut her son off? I could almost hear it. Half the world would say yes. Half would call me heartless. But they wouldn't know that this wasn't a cut. It was a stitch. A way to mend something that had been torn too long. I stacked the papers neatly, aligning the edges. The sound of paper sliding against paper was strangely soothing. I thought of all the times I had signed documents for others, field trips, rent checks, tax forms, never realizing that every signature was a silent vow to keep everything together. This time, I was signing for myself. My hands trembled a little as I opened the savings ledger. The pages were soft, yellowed at the edges. The balance wasn't large, but it was enough. Enough to live modestly, to breathe without asking anyone for permission. Enough to remind me that self-respect isn't measured in numbers, but in choices. I turned off the kitchen light and sat back in the half-darkness, letting the glow of the desk lamp outline the shape of the chest and the papers inside. It looked almost like a shrine now, a monument to quiet perseverance. On the wall above the table hung a faded photo of Evan at 10 years old, holding up a fish he'd caught with his father. His grin was wide, his eyes proud. I studied that face for a long time. "I don't know where that boy went," I whispered, "but I hope he finds his way back." The rain grew heavier, drumming softly on the roof. I imagined it washing the whole town clean, the gossip, the shame, the noise. Then I reached for the pen again and wrote a second line under the first. If I stay silent long enough, maybe he'll hear the echo. I closed the notebook, placed it on top of the chest, and wrapped both hands around my teacup. The liquid had gone cold, but I drank it anyway. Bitterness can be grounding when you understand where it comes from. The clock struck midnight. The sound was deep and low, vibrating through the floorboards. I counted each chime. 12, each one marking the distance between the woman I used to be and the one I was becoming. When the last note faded, I turned off the lamp. The papers remained on the table, glowing faintly in the silver wash of moonlight. Somewhere deep inside, I felt a strange kind of peace. Not comfort, not closure, but peace. The kind that comes when you stop trying to fix someone else and start repairing yourself. Before heading to bed, I paused at the door and looked back at the chest one more time. People think power comes from speaking louder than everyone else, but sometimes power comes from the decision to stop explaining. Tomorrow, I will walk into the bank and make it official. I would reclaim my name, my accounts, my home, not out of revenge, out of self-respect. And if anyone asked why, I already knew my answer. Because a mother's love can forgive almost anything, but dignity, once lost, has to be earned back in silence. I turned off the last light, the rain still falling steady outside, and let the night close around me like a soft curtain. Morning arrived wrapped in fog, the kind that makes everything look softer than it really is. I didn't sleep much, but I felt clear, steady, like a calm tide after a storm. The decision had already been made. Now it was only a matter of formality. I dressed carefully, not because I wanted to impress anyone, but because dignity has a way of showing through the smallest details. A pressed blouse, a brushed coat, a silver brooch my late husband once gave me. When I looked in the mirror, I barely recognized the woman staring back. Her eyes were tired, yes, but calm, focused. The drive to River State Bank took 15 minutes. The roads were empty, lined with trees dripping from the night's rain. I could hear the rhythm of the windshield wipers, steady, rhythmic, almost meditative. When I walked in, the lobby was quiet. Fluorescent lights hummed softly, and the air smelled faintly of paper and coffee. Behind the counter stood Mr. Daniels, a man in his 50s with kind eyes and a voice that always carried a note of respect. He looked up when he saw me. "Mrs. Harper," he said gently, "I'm glad you came in. I was going to call you." I nodded. I figured as much. He gestured for me to sit, his hands folded carefully on the desk. "There's something I need to tell you," he said, lowering his voice. "At around midnight, someone tried to access your account, an online transfer attempt. It didn't go through. Our verification flagged it. but we traced the request to a secondary user profile. He paused, watching my reaction. I didn't flinch. I had expected it, though hearing it confirmed it still felt like a small fracture under the ribs. He hesitated before adding, "It was your son's login, ma'am." For a moment, I just looked at him. The way his expression softened, as if he wanted to apologize on behalf of the entire world. Then I exhaled slowly and said, "Then it's time to tidy things up." He nodded, professional but visibly moved. "All right," he said, opening a folder. "Let's go through everything step by step." The next 30 minutes unfolded with a precision that felt almost sacred. Page after page slid across the desk. Legal forms, authorizations, amendments. The soft scratch of the pen filled the air like a quiet rhythm. I signed the first paper, revocation of beneficiary rights. The second, transfer of assets into a living trust. The third, freeze and remove access from secondary accounts. Each signature was a heartbeat, deliberate and final. The pen glided smoothly, leaving behind trails of blue ink that looked like rivers on white land. Mr. Daniels explained each document patiently. "This one ensures no online withdrawals without your in-person authorization. This one secures your rental income into the trust. And this," he said, tapping the final page, "removes your son's automatic beneficiary status." He looked up, eyes kind but searching. "Do you wish to remove your son's name, Mrs. Harper?" I didn't hesitate. I met his gaze, my voice soft but unwavering. "No, I don't wish to. I need to." There was a pause. Not uncomfortable, just real. He nodded, his lips pressing into a thin, respectful line. "All right then, we'll finalize it." He turned the paper toward me. I picked up the pen again, but this time my hand trembled, not from doubt, just from the weight of it, the finality. When the tip of the pen touched paper, a tear rolled down my cheek, landing right beside my name. It blurred the ink slightly, but I didn't wipe it away. Some things are meant to stain. Mr. Daniels pretended not to notice, though his voice softened. "It takes courage to do what's right, Mrs. Harper. Not everyone can." I smiled faintly. "It's not courage," I said. "It's clear." He printed the confirmation slips and placed them neatly in a folder with my name embossed on the cover. "There," he said quietly. "Everything is in order. You're safe now." The word safe hit me differently than I expected. Not like protection, but like ownership. Like something I had earned back after years of giving it away piece by piece. As I stood to leave, Mr. Daniels hesitated again. "For what it's worth," he said, "you remind me of my mother. She raised 3 of us alone. We didn't understand what she carried until it was too late to say thank you." I smiled gently. "Then say it anyway. She'll hear it, wherever she is." He looked away for a moment, pretending to check the papers, but I saw the flicker of emotion behind his composure. As I left the bank, the automatic doors slid open with a soft hiss. The sunlight had broken through the fog, laying gold across the pavement. I stood there for a moment, letting the warmth touch my face. In my bag, the folder felt heavier than it should have. Full of signatures, yes, but also full of years of restraint, effort, and silent endurance. People would talk, I knew. Can you believe she cut her own son off? Heartless. I'd never do that to my family. Let them. They didn't see the nights I worked late sewing clothes for neighbors to pay the mortgage. They didn't hear the words he said or the silence that followed. They didn't feel what it's like to have your child turn your wrinkles into entertainment for strangers. This wasn't punishment. It was protection. A mother's way of saying enough. As I walked toward my car, the folder pressed against my side like a shield. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel small. I didn't feel like the TikTok mom. I felt like myself again. Sylvia Harper, the woman who built everything she owned from scratch, the one who no longer needed anyone's permission to keep her peace. I looked back once through the bank's glass doors. Inside, Mr. Daniels was still at his desk sorting papers. The light caught on his glasses, reflecting a soft gleam. He glanced up and saw me standing there. He raised his hand slightly in a quiet goodbye. I nodded, then turned away, the click of my heels echoing against the marble floor like punctuation marks at the end of a long, unfinished sentence. Outside, a breeze lifted the edges of my coat, carrying away the last trace of hesitation. For the first time since this all began, I walked not as someone's mother, but as my own witness. And as the bank's doors closed behind me with a gentle sigh, I whispered under my breath, just for myself. Peace signed, sealed, and delivered. The afternoon sunlight filtered through the lace curtains, spilling gold across the hardwood floor. I had just finished dusting the mantel when I heard the sound of tires on gravel. A sleek white car pulled up the driveway. Evan's. For a second, I thought maybe, just maybe, he'd come alone to talk. But then I saw her step out, Chloe. Pretty, polished, and carrying her phone like a weapon. I had seen her before, in short clips, flashing smiles, talking about healing journeys and manifesting success. They didn't knock. The front door creaked open, and Evan called out, "Mom, you home?" I turned slowly, wiping my hands on a cloth. "Always," I said. "Come in." Chloe's heels clicked across the wooden floor. She looked around the living room, taking in the old piano, the mismatched bookshelves, the worn armchair by the window. Her lips curled into a small, careful smile. "Your little cottage has such vintage charm, Mrs. Harper." Her tone was syrupy sweet, but the word little carried its own weight. I smiled back, not unkindly. Charm is what time leaves for those not afraid of it. Chloe blinked, unsure whether it was a compliment or a warning. Evan laughed lightly, shoving his hands into his jacket pockets. "You still talkin' riddles, Mom." He looked around the house as if seeing it for the first time. "You know, Chloe and I were thinking it might be easier if we stayed here for a while, just until we figure out what's next. Rent's high and you've got the space." He said it so casually, as though this house were just another line item in a budget he controlled. I set the cloth down carefully. "Stayed here?" "Yeah," he said. "It'll be good for you, too. You shouldn't be alone all the time." Chloe nodded eagerly. "We can help you modernize things. Maybe film some cozy lifestyle content together, living simply with Sylvia. It would go viral." Her enthusiasm was genuine. Her understanding wasn't. I walked to the window and looked out at the oak tree swaying in the light breeze. For years, Evan used to climb that tree. He'd call down, "Look, Mama, I can see the whole world from up here." Now he wanted to move back, not for comfort, but for convenience. When I turned back, my voice was calm. "You want to live here?" "Yeah," he said, shrugging. "It's practical. Saves us money. You've got that guest room, right?" He glanced at Chloe and she smiled again, clearly proud of the plan. I studied them for a moment, two young people who thought life was a series of scenes to curate, not choices to stand by. And yet, they were still my family. My son. I took a breath. My words came out quiet, deliberate, almost gentle. "Evan, you can't live in a house you've disrespected." He froze. The smile faded, replaced by confusion, then irritation. "What's that supposed to mean?" I met his gaze steadily. "You made this home a joke for strangers. You turned your mother into a spectacle. This house was built on my labor, my silence, and your father's hands. And now, you come asking for shelter without a trace of remorse." His jaw tightened. "It was just a video, Mom. People joke online all the time." "Yes," I said softly. "But you didn't laugh with me, Evan. You laughed at me. And you invited the world to join you." Chloe's eyes darted between us, uncomfortable. "Mrs. Harper, I think you're taking it—" I raised my hand slightly. She stopped mid-sentence. My voice remained calm, even tender. "You're guests in this memory, dear, and I'm the one who decides when it ends." Evan's tone sharpened. "You're overreacting. I'm your son." I nodded. "Exactly, which is why I'm not raising my voice." The air in the room felt dense, full of the unsaid. He took a step closer. "So that's it? You're choosing your pride over your family?" I looked at him then, not as the boy I'd raised, but but as the man who hadn't learned where respect begins. "No," I said. "I'm choosing peace over noise." He stared at me, unblinking. "You changed the bank access, didn't you?" I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The silence said enough. He let out a bitter laugh. "Wow, you really did it. Guess the internet was right. People our age have to earn everything twice." I stepped closer until we were nearly face to face. "No, Evan. You just have to earn what you've already been given once." Chloe tugged his arm, whispering, "Let's go." Her tone was nervous now, the performance gone. He hesitated. I could see the battle in his expression. Pride against guilt, frustration against shame. Finally, he turned toward the door. "Fine. Enjoy your empty house, Mom." I followed them to the entryway. The floorboards creaked under our steps, the same sound they used to make when he'd sneak out as a teenager. At the door, I said softly, "Take care of yourself, Evan. I mean it." He didn't respond. He slammed the car door instead. The engine roared to life, then faded down the road until there was only silence. Chloe had left a faint trace of perfume behind, something expensive and temporary. I opened the window, letting the breeze sweep it away. Then I turned the lock on the door. The click echoed through the house, a small, firm sound, final but not cruel. The setting sun poured through the window, casting long lines of amber light across the wooden floor. It reached the framed photo of Evan as a child, the one where he was holding a toy hammer beside his father, grinning from ear to ear. I stood there a long time, watching the dust motes dance in the fading light. Boundaries, I thought, are not walls. They're doors that you learn to close gently. I exhaled slowly, my heartbeat steady again. Then, as if the house understood, the clock in the hallway began to tick louder. Sure, rhythmic, unbothered. Each sound reminded me. I hadn't lost a son. I'd reclaimed myself. Days passed like pages turned by someone else's hand. The house had grown used to silence again. The kettle whistled only for one, and the porch light flickered out each night with no footsteps returning to cross its glow. One morning, as I folded laundry, the television droned faintly in the background. I wasn't paying attention until I heard his name. Evan Harper, rising digital personality, lands a new brand partnership. The anchor's voice was bright, proud. They showed clips of him laughing, posing beside Chloe, his arms slung around her shoulders. Behind them was a gleaming apartment skyline I didn't recognize. The caption beneath read, "Family man with a quirky sense of humor." I stood frozen, a towel still in my hands. There he was, my son, smiling, thriving, performing. And me? Just another invisible line in his backstory. For a moment, I felt something raw and dangerous stir inside me. Not hate, something quieter, colder. The desire to see justice, but through pain. To make him feel small the way he'd made me feel. Then, almost as if the universe had sensed it, the doorbell rang. It was Nora. She stepped inside, holding a basket of muffins and the kind of concern that comes wrapped in friendship but edged with fury. "I saw the news," she said, before even sitting down. "He's out there playing victim, saying you misunderstood the joke. The comments are awful. People think you're the bitter one." She placed the basket down harder than she meant to. "You can't let him get away with this, Syl. You should sue him. Emotional distress, defamation, something. Make him pay." Her voice trembled with loyalty, but also helpless anger. I loved her for it. I poured her tea, my hands steady. "Nora," I said softly, "the world already will." She frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" I smiled faintly. The same people who build you up for entertainment are the first to pull you down when they get bored. He doesn't need my lawsuit. He needs time. She leaned back, shaking her head. "You're too kind, Syl. If it were me, I'd burn the whole internet down." I chuckled quietly. "And you'd look beautiful doing it." That made her laugh, a short, brittle sound that softened the air. But when she left, her words stayed behind, echoing in the walls long after the door shut. That night, I sat by the window with a blanket draped over my knees. Outside, the street was still. Across the road, in the Lambert family's house, I could see silhouettes moving behind the curtains. Children running, someone setting the table, a burst of laughter. Their life glowed warm in contrast to mine, like a painting of everything I used to have. I pressed my hand against the cool glass. The reflection stared back, my face, lined but alive, framed by the faint halo of the lamp behind me. The woman looking back didn't need an audience. She just needed peace. The news segment replayed in my mind, Evan's grin, Chloe's glittering smile, the word family man. I could almost hear Nora's voice again. Sue him, Syl. For a heartbeat, the temptation flared once more. I imagined the thrill of watching him lose what he'd gained, the public humiliation, the vindication. It would be easy. I had evidence, contracts, witnesses. But then I remembered that justice obtained through spite is never justice. It's just noise in a different pitch. I whispered into the quiet, forgiveness isn't weakness. It's a boundary made of grace. The words lingered, soft but solid. I thought about all the mothers I'd known through the years, women who gave up dreams, time, health, only to watch their children rewrite history without them. And yet, they kept loving, quietly, without applause. Maybe forgiveness wasn't letting go of what someone did to you. Maybe it was letting go of what their actions did inside you. I closed the curtains and made myself a cup of tea. The steam curled upward like a small, faithful ritual. The house hummed with the sound of pipes, the faint ticking of the wall clock, the whisper of rain starting outside. When I sat back down, I opened my notebook, the same one where I'd written, "Plan for peace, not revenge." On the next line, I wrote, "Healing begins when the heart no longer seeks witnesses." I underlined it twice. Outside, the laughter from across the street faded as the Lamberts turned off their lights. The neighborhood slipped into darkness, except for my porch lamp, the one I kept on for years, waiting for Evan's car to pull in. Tonight, I left it off. In that darkness, I finally understood that solitude isn't punishment. It's protection. It's the space you make for yourself when the world has taken too much of your voice. Still, I missed him. That was the part I couldn't lie about. Every mother does, no matter how deep the wound. The ache of missing doesn't vanish when you set boundaries. It just learns how to breathe quietly beside you. The tea had gone cold again. I smiled faintly at the habit. Every night since this began, I'd made tea and forgotten to drink it. Maybe that was my way of honoring time, of letting something cool down before consuming it. I stood, turned off the lamp, and looked once more through the glass. My reflection vanished into the dark. All that remained was the faint outline of the world outside. Quiet, patient, waiting. Somewhere out there, my son was laughing on a screen. And somewhere deeper, I hoped, a part of him still remembered the woman who taught him that silence doesn't mean surrender. The rain grew heavier, tapping steadily on the windows like fingertips in prayer. I whispered again, not for him this time, but for myself. Grace, not vengeance. That's how I'll win. Then I drew the curtains shut, sealing the night outside, and walked toward my bed. The clock ticked on, steady as breath, marking the rhythm of a woman learning to live by her own heartbeat again. 3 weeks passed before the letter arrived. A thin white envelope, no return address, just the embossed seal of River State Bank glinting under the porch light. I almost didn't open it. I thought it was another statement, another quiet reminder of everything I had already handled, but the words inside made my heart stop for a moment. Suspicious access attempt detected. Please contact us immediately regarding a transaction authorization submitted under your name. My eyes lingered on the next line. Attached. Transfer request form. Signature verification pending. There it was. My name, my handwriting, my signature. Except it wasn't mine. I sat down at the kitchen table, the same table where I had once taught Evan how to write his first letters, guiding his little hand over the paper. Round your O's, I used to say. Make them full. Don't leave them open. The O in this forged document was too perfect, too hollow. For a long minute, I just stared at it. I didn't cry, I didn't curse. I just listened to the sound of the clock ticking, steady and merciless. Tick, tick, tick. I picked up the phone and called the only person I trusted with both my heart and my history, Mr. Finch, my late husband's old friend, now a semi-retired lawyer who still wore his compassion like a pressed suit. He answered on the third ring. "Mrs. Harper," he said in that gravelly voice of his, "I was just thinking of you. What happened?" "Someone," I said slowly, "submitted a fake transfer under my name. The bank thinks it was a family." There was a pause on the other end. Not surprise, just sadness. "Do you want me to come over?" he asked. "Yes," I whispered. "Please." Within an hour, he was sitting across from me at that same table, glasses low on his nose, studying the papers with quiet intensity. His hair had gone silver since I last saw him, but his eyes were as sharp as ever. After a long silence, he looked up. "It's your son's handwriting," he said softly, but whoever helped him knew enough about the procedure to make it dangerous. I nodded. I didn't need confirmation, but hearing it out loud made it real. He sighed. "You have every right to press charges, Sylvia. This qualifies as fraud." I looked at the paper again, the imitation of my name, the familiarity of his loops and lines. "Press charges?" I repeated. "No, I just want to close the door." He leaned back, studying me. "You always were the quiet kind of strong." I smiled faintly. "Silence isn't weakness, Mr. Finch. It's just selective participation." He chuckled, though the sadness didn't leave his eyes. "Then let's finish this cleanly." He pulled out his briefcase, laying down a new set of documents. Revocation of joint authority, termination of financial access, formal closure of any secondary beneficiary accounts. Each line felt like a verdict written in ink. I read every word carefully before I signed, not because I doubted him, but because this time I wanted to be fully present in the moment of reclaiming what was mine. The pen felt heavy between my fingers. The nib touched paper, and I began to sign, slowly, deliberately. The air around us seemed to thicken with the sound, the faint scratch of ink, the soft shuffle of paper, the steady ticking of the wall clock. Tick, tick, tick. Mr. Finch watched in respectful silence. The lamplight flickered slightly, casting a warm but fragile glow over the documents. When I finished, I laid the pen down and exhaled. The room felt smaller, quieter. He gathered the papers carefully. "This will notify all branches. Your accounts are safe now. He won't be able to touch a cent." I nodded, staring at the papers he stacked neatly in front of me. "Are you sure you don't want to take legal action?" he asked again, his tone more cautious this time. He crossed a serious line. I smiled, though my voice came out barely above a whisper. "I'm sure. The law can punish him. But life will teach him." He nodded slowly, accepting what I meant. As he packed up his briefcase, he paused and looked at me with something like admiration. "You remind me of your husband," he said. "He always said the hardest battles are fought in silence." I felt my throat tighten. "He used to tell me that when the world turned loud." Mr. Finch stood, adjusting his coat. "You're stronger than you realize, Sylvia, and kinder than most would be in your place." I watched him leave, the door closing softly behind him. The sound echoed through the house like a heartbeat. When I was alone again, I turned off the main lights and sat in the half-darkness, letting the quiet settle over me. The papers were still spread across the table, glowing faintly in the lamp's low light. I could almost hear Evan's voice in my head, childlike, innocent, asking, "Mama, why do you always double-check everything?" And I could hear my own answer from years ago, "Because love is honest, but people aren't always ready for honesty." The irony wasn't lost on me. I looked down at the final copy of the closure form. His name struck through, mine standing alone beneath the heading Primary Account Holder, Sylvia Ann Harper. The ink shimmered slightly under the light. It felt both heavy and liberating at once. For a moment, I allowed myself to imagine what people would say if they knew. She erased her own son. She went too far. A mother should forgive. They wouldn't understand that this wasn't revenge. It was self-preservation. that there's a difference between cutting someone off and letting them fall by their own choices. Still, I knew it would divide hearts. Some would call it justice, others would call it cruelty, but none of them lived the quiet nights I did, the humiliation, the betrayal, the ache of realizing love can rot when watered with entitlement. When the clock struck 11, I gathered all the documents and placed them back inside the wooden chest. The brass corners gleamed faintly under the dim light, like the edges of a closed wound catching the sun. As I locked it, the ticking clock seemed to grow louder again. Tick, tick, tick. Each beat marked an ending that didn't need applause. I stood, ran my hand along the smooth surface of the chest and whispered, not with anger, but with release. I loved him enough to stop him. Then I turned off the light. The room fell into darkness, but it wasn't empty anymore. It was peace, earned, deliberate, complete. The morning began like any other. A quiet kitchen, pale light spilling through the curtains, the faint smell of chamomile rising from my cup. The world outside moved as if nothing had changed. Birds perched on the fence. The clock ticked steadily. And then, my phone buzzed. A message appeared on the screen. "Evan, Mom, did you do this? My balance is 0. I read it once, then again." There was no greeting, no apology, not even confusion, just panic wearing the shape of accusation. I stared at the message for a long time. The words didn't hurt anymore. They just sounded like echoes in a room I no longer lived in. The kettle clicked softly behind me, pulling me back to the present. I placed the phone face down on the counter and poured myself another cup of tea. No reply, no explanation, no defense, just quiet. I sat at the table, feeling the warmth seep through the porcelain into my palms. The house hummed with its usual stillness, and for once, that silence didn't feel empty. It felt earned. Somewhere in another part of town, I imagined him at the bank. The same branch, the same counter, the same air-conditioned chill. I could almost see it unfold in my mind. The sterile hum of fluorescent lights, the soft shuffle of paper, the tap of his anxious fingers on the desk. He'd lean forward, voice strained. There must be some mistake. My balance shows 0. The teller, young, polite, wearing the same uniform Mr. Daniels once did, would glance at the screen, then lower her voice out of courtesy. "Sir, all linked accounts were recently closed. Ownership has reverted to the primary holder." "You mean my mother?" "Yes, and according to the record, all access has been formally revoked." He'd blink, disbelief flickering into something darker. "Deleted? You deleted my name?" The teller would hesitate, then say softly, "Balance 0, all accounts deleted." And in that moment, for the first time in his life, Evan Harper would understand the full weight of consequence. Not through shouting, not through punishment, but through absence. No one yelling, no one rescuing, just silence where comfort used to be. I took a slow sip of tea, the warmth steadying me. Outside, the wind brushed through the trees, scattering the last of the early leaves across the porch. It wasn't a victory. It wasn't revenge. It was the simple restoration of balance, things returning to where they belonged. The system had done what I asked weeks ago, transfer all authority back to the rightful owner. But what I hadn't expected was the automated security process. Once it detected fraudulent activity, it permanently locked all linked profiles, even his. He wasn't erased. He was simply returned to himself. And that, I realized, was its own kind of justice. The phone buzzed again. "Evan, you've ruined me. How could you?" Still, I didn't reply. Not because I wanted to ignore him, but because words wouldn't teach what silence could. He had mocked me online for being old, irrelevant, out of touch, but he had never understood that the quiet people, the ones who watch, wait, and measure, carry their power differently. They don't explode. They simply shift the ground beneath your feet. I looked up at the clock. 10:30. The same time I used to leave for the market when he was a boy, the same hour he'd wait by the window, watching for my car to pull back into the driveway. Now the roles have reversed. He was the one waiting, except this time the door wouldn't open. The tea cooled slowly in front of me. Each sip felt like punctuation. Steady, deliberate, final. The light outside changed, growing brighter as the day unfolded. Somewhere in the distance, a lawnmower started up, cutting through the morning calm. Life, relentless, continuing. I picked up my phone one last time and looked at the string of unread messages piling up. Mom, please answer. I didn't mean to. You can't just ignore me. Please. Each one shorter, more desperate than the last. For a moment, my thumb hovered over the keyboard. Old habits die hard. Every mother knows that instinct. To comfort, to fix, to respond. But then I thought of the forged signature, the laughter on the screen, the stranger's comments calling me a ridiculous old lady. No, I thought. Some lessons must be learned in the echo of your own choices. I turned off the phone and placed it back on the table, next to the folded napkin. Outside, sunlight slipped through the window, hitting the brass lock on the front door. It glowed faintly, gold on wood. The same door I'd locked the day I told him to leave. The same door that now stood as both barrier and boundary. I took another sip of tea and whispered, almost as if he could hear it through the silence between us, "You can't live in a house you've disrespected, or in a heart you've broken." Somewhere, the ticking clock answered back, steady, patient, forgiving only in rhythm. I imagined him sitting in his car outside the bank, phone in hand, watching the balance read 0 again and again, like a sentence he couldn't rewrite. No angry outburst, no scene, just the hollow sound of realization. The world would call it cold. Some might even say cruel, but I knew the truth. It was mercy disguised as consequence. When you strip away entitlement, what remains is clarity, and clarity is the kindest punishment of all. The room was filled only with soft sound, the clink of the spoon, the faint wind outside, and the low hum of peace settling in. I didn't need to explain anything. Not to him, not to anyone. Because sometimes, silence says everything words never could. Autumn came earlier that year. The leaves turned faster. The air thinned quicker. Everything seemed to shed its disguise, one quiet layer at a time. I was in the garden, trimming the last of the marigolds, when Nora appeared at the gate, breathless and holding her phone like it was something alive. "Syl," she said softly, "you might want to see this." I took off my gloves and wiped my hands on my apron. On her phone screen, an article was open, one of those glossy online tabloids that thrived on rise and ruin. Viral star Evan Harper loses brand contract amid fraud allegations. Partner Chloe Marks distances herself in new statement. Below the headlines was a photo of Evan, not the polished, confident man from his videos. This version looked smaller, thinner, his smile cracked at the edges. Nora's voice was careful. They found out some of his followers were bought fake engagement numbers. The sponsor pulled everything. I stared at the screen, the garden shears still in my hand. The words didn't sting. They weren't even shocked. They simply landed. "He'll survive," I said quietly. "Maybe," she replied. "But Chloe won't stick around. She already deleted every photo of them together. You know how that world works." She was right. By the time the sun set that evening, the internet had already rewritten him, from charismatic creator to cautionary tale. For a moment, I wondered if this was justice, or just the same machine turning in reverse. Applause replaced by laughter, admiration by ridicule. Either way, it was loud, too loud. That night, I turned off my phone, pulled the curtains closed, and sat by the window. Outside, the street lamp flickered, casting thin ribbons of light across the oak tree. I thought of him, my son, somewhere in that noise, drowning in his own echo. Days later, I went into town. The air carried the scent of roasted chestnuts and early winter. People were bundled up, moving quickly, their faces flushed from the wind. And then I saw him. It was near the town square, under the stone clock tower. A small group had gathered, not to film, not to celebrate, just to pass by. Evan sat on the cold pavement, a guitar resting against his leg. His fingers moved mechanically across the strings, the sound raw and uneven. A paper cup sat by his feet, half filled with coins. He wasn't performing for attention, he was just playing to stay standing. Chloe wasn't there. The phone that once never left his hand was gone. The confident tilt of his shoulders, the casual smirk, all of it erased by something humbler, quieter. I stopped at the edge of the crowd. He didn't see me. Or maybe he did, and chose not to look up. For a long time, I stood there, watching, listening. Each note he played felt like an apology because he didn't know how to speak. The melody trembled, fragile but earnest. When a gust of wind swept through the square, scattering the leaves around him, he kept playing. That was the moment I realized he wasn't just broken. He was finally alone enough to hear himself. I could have gone to him. I could have stepped forward, touched his shoulder, said something, anything. But instead, I stayed where I was. Because sometimes, love means not interrupting the lesson life is trying to teach. When the song ended, he looked down, collecting the coins quietly. His face tilted toward the ground, but I saw the exhaustion etched into it. The kind that comes not from poverty, but from pretending too long. I turned away before our eyes could meet. My footsteps echoed softly on the cobblestones as I walked back toward home. The sun was dipping low, and the sky bled into shades of lavender and gold. Everything looked softer in that light, like the world was trying to make peace with itself. When I reached my porch, I unlocked the door and stepped into the warmth of the house. The air smelled faintly of tea and old wood. On the mantel sat my husband's photograph, his gentle eyes frozen forever in sepia calm. I lit a candle in front of it, the flame flickering with quiet steadiness. Then I sat down with my journal. The leather cover was worn at the corners, the pages uneven where tears had fallen over the years. I opened to a blank page and wrote slowly, letting the words shape themselves without rush or emotion. When the world stops applauding, maybe he'll start listening. The sentence stood alone, deliberate, final. I stared at it for a while, the ink glistening faintly before it dried. The candlelight danced across the walls, catching on the framed photos, the shelves, the old wooden chest in the corner, the same chest that had held every piece of paper tied to my survival. Now it held peace instead. I closed the journal gently, pressing my palm against the cover as if sealing the thought inside. Outside, the wind howled softly through the trees, but inside, the clock ticked in calm defiance. I walked back to the mantel and placed the journal beside my husband's picture. The candle's flame bent slightly in the draft, then straightened again. In its light, I whispered, "He's learning, Henry, the hard way, but the right one." The photograph seemed to smile back, not literally, but in that strange way memories do when you let them. For the first time in months, I didn't feel the ache of betrayal. I just felt distance, the kind that protects rather than punishes. I sat there until the candle burned low, watching the wax pool at its base. Each drop fell in rhythm with the ticking clock. Steady, inevitable, alive. When the flame finally flickered out, the darkness that followed didn't feel empty. It felt earned. And as I walked to my room, the sentence from my journal echoed softly in my mind, not as bitterness, but as blessing. When the world stops applauding, maybe he'll start listening. Spring came softly that year, almost like an apology. The earth began to breathe again, the soil loosening, the grass daring to return, the air full of something fragile and new. I was sitting on the porch, trimming dried stems from the flower pots, when I heard footsteps on the gravel. Slow, hesitant ones. I looked up. There he was, Evan. He stood at the end of the walkway, hands stuffed awkwardly in his jacket pockets, a small bouquet of wildflowers in one hand, daisies, clover, and a sprig of baby's breath. They looked like they'd been picked from the roadside. For a moment, I didn't move. I just watched him. The boy I'd raised, the man I'd lost, and the stranger I was now seeing again. All of them somehow in the same frame. His clothes were plain, his hair unstyled, his shoulders carrying a quiet weight that hadn't been there before. When he finally spoke, his voice cracked in the middle, like a guitar string that had been pulled too tight for too long. "Mom, I got a job at a workshop. It's small, but it's mine." The words hung in the morning air, trembling, honest. I felt my throat tighten. He didn't say, "I'm sorry." He didn't have to. The humility in his voice said everything. I stood, brushing the soil from my hands, and walked toward him slowly. The air between us felt both endless and fragile. When I reached him, I looked at the wildflowers in his hand. Their stems were uneven, some broken, some still damp from dew. "Then start from your own hands," I said quietly, "like I once did." He nodded, his eyes filling. He tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. Instead, he just stood there, tears spilling silently down his cheeks. I reached out, not to embrace him, but to rest a hand gently on his shoulder. It was the first touch between us in what felt like a lifetime. His breath hitched, and he whispered, "I don't deserve this." I met his gaze and replied, "Respect is wealth, son. You finally earned some." He lowered his head, crying openly now, not like a child begging for forgiveness, but like a man realizing what forgiveness truly costs. For a long time we stood there, no words, just the sound of wind moving through the early blossoms, the faint rustle of petals brushing against the porch rail. He looked older, calmer, the kind of tiredness that comes not from exhaustion, but from rebuilding. Finally, he said softly, "I didn't think you'd even open the door." I smiled faintly. "I didn't need to. You knocked differently this time." He laughed once through his tears, a small, cracked sound that carried years of weight. Then he looked down at the flowers again. "They're not much," he murmured. "They're honest," I said. "That's more than enough." I took the bouquet and placed it in an old glass jar on the porch table. The water inside caught the light, making the petals shimmer faintly. For a while, we sat together in silence, watching the breeze play with the branches. The air smelled of rain and new beginnings. He told me about the workshop, a small repair shop outside of town. He said he fixed old furniture, sanded wood, and mended what others threw away. As he spoke, I could hear a quiet pride in his tone, something unpolished but real. "It's not glamorous," he said, "but it feels solid, like I'm making something that lasts." I nodded, remembering all the nights I had sat at this very porch, sewing clothes by lamplight to pay the bills, my fingers raw but my spirit steady. "The best things rarely start glamorous," I said. "They just started." He looked at me for a long moment. "I used to think you stayed silent because you were weak." I smiled softly. "And now?" He swallowed hard. "Now I know silence is what's strength." Sounds like when it's done talking. That line, I thought, would have made his father proud. The sun shifted, pouring warmth across the porch. Somewhere in the distance, a mockingbird sang. He stood after a while, wiping his eyes with the back of his sleeve. "I should go," he said, his voice steady now. "I've got a shift at noon." I nodded. "Then go. Work hard. Stay kind." He hesitated. "Will I see you again?" I looked at him, the cautious hope in his eyes, the humility, the fragile light trying to grow back inside him. "You will," I said, "when the work is honest." He nodded slowly, understanding what I meant. Then he turned to leave. Halfway down the path, he stopped and looked back. "Mom?" "Yes?" "Thank you for not giving up on me, even when you had every reason to." I didn't answer. I just smiled and watched him walk away, the sunlight catching in his hair, the wind carrying the faint scent of wildflowers he'd left behind. When he disappeared down the road, I sat back on the porch, the bouquet beside me. The petals swayed gently in the breeze, humble, imperfect, alive. Inside, the clock ticked softly, not as a reminder this time, but as a rhythm to something new beginning. I whispered into the quiet air, "He's starting over, and so am I." The wildflowers gleamed faintly in the sunlight, their colors uneven but beautiful, proof that even things grown in wild soil can bloom again. And as the morning stretched forward, I felt the house breathe differently, lighter somehow, as if the walls themselves had forgiven too. A few months later, spring had ripened into summer. The garden bloomed again. Bright marigolds, lavender, small bursts of color that didn't ask for attention, only sunlight. The house was quiet but no longer heavy. There was warmth in the stillness now, not sorrow. Every morning I brewed tea and read the newspaper on the porch. Sometimes there'd be small mentions of local events, a fair, a fundraiser, or the new woodworking class at the community hall. Evan's name appeared once, at the bottom of a short article. Local craftsman donates wooden sculptures to town square. The photograph was grainy, but I recognized the hands holding the chisel. My son's. He'd been working steadily at the workshop, Nora told me. No new accounts, no sponsorships, no online spotlight, just long hours sanding, carving, repairing. She said he smiled more now, quiet smiles that didn't need cameras to exist. It was enough. One Saturday, the town held a small ceremony near the square. I didn't plan to go, but my feet led me there anyway. The sky was pale blue, the air smelled of pine and sawdust. At the center of the square stood a wooden sculpture. Not tall, not grand, just human-sized. The figure of a woman seated on a bench, hands folded in her lap, gaze lifted slightly toward the horizon. The plaque beneath read, "The Woman Who Waited in Islands." Sculpted by Evan Harper. My breath caught. The carving wasn't perfect. The lines were rough, the edges uneven, but the expression was unmistakable. It was mine. Or rather, the version of me he had finally learned to see. I stepped closer. The figure's face was calm, not smiling, but full of patience. The kind of patience that doesn't come from endurance, but from understanding. Around me, a few townsfolk stood quietly. Some read the plaque. Others nodded at the craftsmanship. No one spoke loudly. It didn't need noise to be moving. I stood there for a long while, my hand brushing lightly against the wooden armrest. The texture was familiar, imperfect, living. I could still smell the faint trace of varnish and cedar. He had signed his initials in small letters on the base. E.H. I whispered, "You did it, son." And for a moment, I thought I heard his voice on the wind. Low and steady, like a promise kept in another language. When I returned home that evening, the sun was already setting, casting long, honey-colored shadows through the kitchen window. I caught my reflection in the glass, silver hair pulled back, eyes soft, a faint smile I didn't recognize at first. I leaned closer to the mirror, tilting my head just slightly. The light caught my face in a way that made every wrinkle, every line, look like a record of living well. I smiled again, this time on purpose, and whispered, "That face suits you, old lady." The words, once used to mock me, had turned into something whole, a benediction instead of a wound. I poured myself a cup of tea, the familiar scent curling upward in ribbons of steam. On the table sat my husband's photograph, the same one I'd spoken to so many times. His eyes seemed softer in the candlelight, as if listening still. I lit a small candle beside his picture and whispered, "He's doing fine, Henry. He found his way back." The flame flickered, casting golden ripples across the room. I sat there, sipping slowly, letting the quiet stretch. Every sound felt sacred. The ticking clock, the rustle of the curtains, the faint chirp of crickets outside. Years ago, I thought justice meant setting things right. Now I know. Sometimes justice is just letting peace take root where anger once lived. Forgiveness hadn't erased the hurt. It had simply stopped it from spreading. And that, I realized, was its own kind of miracle. As the candle burned lower, I reached for my notebook one last time. The same notebook that once held my plans for peace, my lists of boundaries, my silent reckonings. I turned to the last page and wrote in slow, deliberate script, "Sometimes justice isn't punishment, it's peaceful." I underlined it once, closed the cover, and exhaled. Outside, a soft wind brushed through the garden, bending the flowers gently without breaking them. The air smelled faintly of wood smoke and renewal. I rose, carried my teacup to the porch, and watched the horizon fade into dusk. Somewhere beyond the trees, I imagined Evan locking up his workshop for the night, wiping sawdust from his hands, proud in the quiet way his father once was. Maybe one day he'd visit again, maybe not. But this time, I wasn't waiting. The house didn't feel empty anymore. It felt balanced, like a story that had learned how to end without needing applause. The candlelight flickered behind me, painting the walls with warmth. I smiled softly and spoke the final truth aloud. Not for him, but for anyone still listening. Sometimes justice isn't punishment, it's peaceful.